It is the worst disaster in the history of the American space program, and President Reagan has declared a week of mourning for the 7 astronauts, 5 men and 2 women, who lost their lives on their way into space this morning.
On the morning of January 28, 1986, a crowd gathered at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Their eyes turned skyward as they waited with anticipation for the launch of NASA's latest space shuttle mission, STS-51L. Among the spectators were family members of the 7 astronauts on board, reporters, school children, and countless Americans watching the live broadcast. It was a cold morning, unusually so for Florida, with temperatures hovering just below freezing. Despite concerns about the cold, the countdown continued. At exactly 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Shuttle Challenger lifted off, climbing into a clear blue sky. Just 73 seconds later, before it had even completed its ascent, Challenger broke apart in mid-air, disintegrating in a fireball and plummeting into the Atlantic Ocean. All 7 crew members were killed. What followed was one of the darkest moments in the history of space exploration, and a tragedy that stunned the world. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. The Challenger disaster was not merely an accident. It was the culmination of a complex series of decisions, technical oversights, and organizational failures. The Space Shuttle Challenger had flown 9 successful missions before the ill-fated STS-51L launch. The mission carried a crew of 7, Francis R. Scobie, the commander, Michael J. Smith, the pilot, mission specialist Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka and Judith Resnick, payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe, a school teacher from New Hampshire who had been selected to be the first civilian in space. McAuliffe's inclusion in the mission garnered massive public interest, especially among students across the United States. She was going to teach lessons from orbit, connecting the public to space in a way never attempted before. The promise of a teacher in space was part of a broader NASA campaign to generate excitement and support for the shuttle program, which was, by the mid-1980s, beginning to show signs of strain. The shuttle was envisioned as a reusable space vehicle that would make access to space routine and affordable. It was supposed to fly dozens of times a year, servicing satellites, conducting experiments, and building a space station. In reality, the shuttle program was over budget, behind schedule, and struggling with technical and safety issues. Each mission took far more preparation than expected, and costs were mounting. Nonetheless, NASA pushed forward, under immense political and public pressure, to maintain a busy launch schedule. Behind the scenes, engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, SRBs, had raised concerns about the potential risks posed by low temperatures. The SRBs used rubber O-ring seals in their joints to prevent hot gases from escaping during launch. Engineers, particularly Roger Boisjoli, had observed that these seals could become brittle and less effective in cold weather. Tests conducted before 1986 indicated that the colder the temperature, the more likely the O-rings were to fail to properly seal. On the night before the launch, temperatures at Cape Canaveral had dropped to an unprecedented 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice was visible on the launch pad. Concerned engineers at Morton Thiokol urged a delay, fearing that the O-rings might not function as needed in such conditions. During a teleconference between Morton Thiokol engineers and NASA officials on January 27th, the debate over whether to proceed with the launch reached a crucial point. Morton Thiokol's engineers recommended delaying the launch until temperatures rose. However, after facing pushback from NASA, who were under pressure to keep the launch schedule on track, Morton Thiokol management overruled their own engineers and gave the green light. The decision was made not on the basis of new evidence, but rather out of a desire to satisfy NASA's expectations and avoid further delay. NASA officials did not fully grasp or acknowledge the severity of the engineering concerns. The next morning, the shuttle was rolled out onto the launch pad, despite the freezing weather. During launch, the solid rocket boosters performed as expected initially, but the cold had compromised the performance of the O-rings on the right booster. Almost immediately after ignition, hot gases began escaping through a gap in the joint, forming a flame that burned through the external fuel tank and the booster attachment strut. At 73 seconds into the flight, structural failure occurred. The shuttle broke apart violently, and the crew cabin was thrown into the air. Contrary to many assumptions at the time, the crew likely survived the initial breakup. The cabin fell for nearly 2.5 minutes before hitting the ocean at over 200 miles per hour, resulting in instant death for the crew. The shock that followed was profound. In classrooms across the country, children who had been watching to see a teacher enter space instead witnessed a horrific explosion. The American public, so accustomed to space triumphs, now found itself confronting tragedy. President Ronald Reagan, who had been preparing to deliver his State of the Union address, postponed the speech and instead addressed the nation that evening. His words were somber and dignified, honoring the bravery of the Challenger crew and affirming the nation's commitment to continue space exploration. "The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted," he said. "It belongs to the brave." In the days and weeks following the disaster, questions mounted. How could something like this happen? Who was responsible? Could it have been prevented? To answer these questions, the federal government established the Rogers Commission, a presidential commission led by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers. The commission included astronaut Neil Armstrong, physicist Richard Feynman, test pilot Chuck Yeager, and several other scientists, engineers, and military experts. Their task was to investigate the causes of the accident and recommend changes to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. What the Rogers Commission found was deeply troubling. The failure of the O-rings was identified as the direct cause of the disaster, but the commission delved deeper, revealing systemic flaws within NASA's organizational culture. NASA had become plagued by poor communication, flawed decision-making, and a dangerous normalization of deviance, an acceptance of anomalies as routine because they hadn't yet resulted in catastrophe. Engineers' warnings were often downplayed or ignored. The shuttle program's success rate had lulled decision-makers into a false sense of security, leading them to take risks that would have previously seemed unacceptable. Perhaps one of the most memorable moments of the Rogers Commission hearings came from Richard Feynman. To demonstrate how cold affected the rubber O-rings, he conducted a simple experiment during a televised hearing. He placed a piece of the rubber in a glass of ice water. The rubber, which was flexible at room temperature, became hard and brittle in the cold. His demonstration dramatically underscored the failure of NASA and Morton Thiokol to adequately account for temperature effects. Feynman later contributed a personal appendix to the Commission's report, in which he wrote, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." His words became a lasting indictment of the organizational dysfunction that allowed the disaster to unfold. As part of the Commission's recommendations, the shuttle program was grounded for nearly 3 years. Major changes were implemented. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned, safety procedures were overhauled, and a new Office of Safety, Reliability, and Quality Assurance was established within NASA. More importantly, the agency was forced to reckon with its internal culture. Communication lines were to be improved, dissenting voices encouraged, and safety given renewed priority. The lessons learned from Challenger would shape every subsequent mission. But the human cost of the disaster remained most searing. Families of the fallen astronauts struggled with grief while navigating the public spotlight. For them, the loss was not only a national tragedy, but a personal one. Christa McAuliffe students, who had so eagerly anticipated watching their teacher float in space, were left with a void that no explanation could fill. The other crew members, too, left behind loved ones, each mourning a life taken too soon. Monuments were erected, scholarships created, and countless tributes paid. Yet the sorrow never fully subsided. In the broader context of spaceflight, the Challenger disaster was a grim reminder that exploration comes with risk. It punctured the illusion of invincibility that surrounded the shuttle program and reminded the world that space travel, despite its awe-inspiring successes, remains an inherently dangerous endeavor. The shuttle was a triumph of engineering, but it was also a machine pushed to its limits, vulnerable to failure when caution gave way to ambition. Despite the tragedy, the shuttle program did return. In 1988, the Discovery shuttle flew a successful mission, restoring some measure of confidence. Over the next 2 decades, the shuttle continued to carry astronauts into orbit, deploy satellites, and assemble the International Space Station. But the specter of Challenger never entirely disappeared. Then in 2003, another shuttle, Columbia, broke apart on re-entry, killing all 7 astronauts aboard. Once again, a seemingly minor flaw, damage to the heat shield from a piece of foam during launch, led to catastrophic consequences. Once again, investigations pointed to systemic failures, missed warnings, and a culture that struggled to balance safety with schedule. The Challenger and Columbia disasters are now bookends in the history of the shuttle program. Both serve as stark reminders of what happens when organizations neglect safety culture in the pursuit of progress. They are case studies taught in engineering schools, referenced in aerospace training, and discussed in management courses. They illustrate the complexity of human systems and the way in which technology, leadership, and communication intersect in high-risk environments. Today, the legacy of Challenger endures not only in remembrance but in reform. NASA has evolved, and new players in the space industry like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others have studied Challenger's lessons carefully. Redundancy, transparency, and continuous testing are now foundational principles for these ventures. Space is once again exciting, with ambitions to return to the moon and reach Mars, but caution is ever present. In the years that followed the Challenger disaster, its reverberations extended far beyond NASA and the field of aerospace engineering. The tragedy became a pivotal cultural and historical event, prompting deep introspection in multiple sectors. From education and journalism to ethics and government accountability, it represented not just a technical failure, but a human one, forcing society to reevaluate the very structures of authority, responsibility, and truth within institutions built on public trust. One of the more subtle but powerful outcomes of the Challenger disaster was its transformation into a watershed moment in American public discourse. In the immediate aftermath, national media outlets not only covered the details of the explosion but also began asking difficult questions about the role of transparency in government-run programs. For decades, NASA had been considered a shining example of American ingenuity, arguably above reproach. Challenger disrupted that narrative. Investigative journalism turned its focus to systemic issues in federal agencies, leading to more critical coverage of institutions that had previously operated in a cocoon of prestige and assumed competence. The media's handling of the event was also notable for its unprecedented emotional impact. Unlike earlier tragedies, this one unfolded on live television, imprinting itself on the minds of millions in real time. There was no opportunity for the government or media to filter or control the narrative in its earliest moments. This unfiltered reality gave rise to a new kind of public engagement, where collective grief, outrage, and demands for accountability emerged simultaneously, largely unmediated by official channels. The event predated the internet and social media, but its effects anticipated the kind of direct and communal response we associate with the digital age. Educational institutions were perhaps most uniquely impacted by the Challenger tragedy. Christa McAuliffe was not merely a passenger on the shuttle, she was the centerpiece of NASA's Teacher in Space project. Her selection had been a strategic move, intended to humanize and democratize space travel. With McAuliffe, the idea was that any ordinary citizen, especially a teacher, could contribute meaningfully to science and exploration. Her presence on the shuttle served as an educational outreach tool, and her televised lessons were meant to inspire generations of children. When the shuttle exploded, the loss was therefore personal to millions of students. Schools across the country had set up viewing parties. Children had drawn pictures, written letters, and prepared questions to be answered from orbit. In the wake of the disaster, classrooms were faced with the unexpected and monumental task of helping students process grief on a national scale. This experience contributed to an evolving understanding of emotional intelligence and trauma-informed education. Teachers had to step into roles as grief counselors, guiding students through confusion and sorrow. Psychologists and child development experts were called upon to help explain how young minds perceive such large-scale loss. These responses laid the groundwork for more comprehensive crisis response protocols in schools, a development that, while born of tragedy, marked a step forward in the broader awareness of children's psychological needs during public emergencies. Within NASA itself, the loss of the Challenger and its crew led to a dramatic shift in how safety, ethics, and engineering decisions were handled internally. one of the most important reforms involved the promotion of what would later be described as a safety culture, a workplace ethos where speaking up about risks was not just permitted, but encouraged. Prior to Challenger, there existed a culture of silent compliance, where engineers and lower-level staff often felt pressured to support decisions made by higher-ups, even when they had reservations. The idea that someone could lose their job or damage their career prospects simply for raising a red flag became a critical point of discussion in the aftermath. As a result, NASA introduced new communication protocols and reporting structures, aiming to flatten the hierarchy when it came to risk assessment. These included anonymous reporting systems and the formalization of dissenting opinions in mission briefings. Technical experts were given more direct access to decision makers, and safety officers were empowered with greater autonomy. The agency's culture began shifting toward a more inclusive, transparent model, though as later events like the Columbia disaster would show, these changes were not always consistently maintained. The Challenger disaster also initiated broader conversations within the engineering community about professional ethics and moral responsibility. Universities revised engineering curricula to include case studies focused on Challenger, emphasizing the importance of ethical decision-making under pressure. The National Society of Professional Engineers and other organizations used the incident to promote stronger codes of conduct. Engineers like Roger Boisjoli, who had voiced concerns prior to the launch, became symbols of integrity in the face of institutional resistance. Boisjoli would later speak publicly and write about his experience, not to seek vindication, but to educate others about the importance of listening to one's moral compass, even when it conflicts with authority. Another area profoundly affected by the Challenger disaster was federal policy concerning civilian involvement in space. The Teacher in Space project, which had been launched with such high hopes, was abruptly terminated after the accident. NASA halted the inclusion of non-astronauts in shuttle missions, deeming the risk too high for individuals who were not professionally trained for spaceflight. It would be over 2 decades before civilians were again considered for orbital missions, and even then, only under vastly different circumstances involving commercial partnerships and far more rigorous safety measures. The tragedy also led to re-evaluation of how space programs are funded, regulated, and held accountable by the federal government. Congressional oversight of NASA increased in the years following the Challenger accident. Funding mechanisms were scrutinized, with lawmakers debating whether budgetary constraints had played a role in pushing NASA toward risky decisions. The tension between scientific ambition and political pressure became more visible. Congress began to demand clearer justifications for each mission's objectives, seeking to ensure that political motivations were not compromising safety or engineering standards. Internationally, Challenger sent ripples through other national space programs. Agencies such as the European Space Agency, Roscosmos in Russia, and Japan's NASDA, now JAXA, conducted internal reviews of their safety protocols in light of what had happened to NASA. The disaster had underscored the universality of risk in space exploration, and no program wanted to experience a similar catastrophe. In some cases, foreign programs delayed or modified upcoming missions to incorporate more thorough inspections. Collaborative efforts with NASA, such as joint research missions and data sharing, were intensified, particularly in the realm of launch vehicle safety. While Challenger's impact on space policy, engineering culture, and education was profound, it also played a significant role in shaping the philosophical and emotional framework around exploration itself. Humanity has always wrestled with the tension between curiosity and caution, and the Challenger disaster crystallized that dynamic in a modern televised context. It forced a reckoning with our assumptions about progress, particularly the idea that technological advancement is always linear or guaranteed. The myth of infallibility, often associated with space missions, was shattered. Challenger reminded society that even our most brilliant systems, backed by the most knowledgeable experts, can be vulnerable to human error, misjudgment, and overconfidence. This realization helped mature the public's relationship with science and technology. It invited more nuanced discussions about risk tolerance, failure, and the ethical dimensions of exploration. In this sense, Challenger served not just as a cautionary tale, but as a kind of initiation, one that prepared humanity for the long, uncertain journey of reaching beyond Earth. Over time, the memory of Challenger was woven into American culture. not as a moment to be feared or avoided, but as one to be honored and learned from. Annual memorials were held. Documentaries, books, and films explored the event from various angles: technical, personal, psychological. The Challenger Center for Space Science Education was founded by the families of the fallen crew as a way to continue their mission. The organization created hands-on, immersive learning environments designed to inspire students to pursue STEM careers. The Challenger Centers that sprang up across the country helped millions of children engage with science in a way that was dynamic, hopeful, and forward-looking. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us? What are your thoughts on the Challenger disaster? What do you think really happened? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.